If you didn't get the memo to read ahead, then I would encourage you to read after. We do not have time to read 2 full chapters before we dive in today, so just going to assume that you have the basic storyline. This would have made a good story, by the way, if this was made into a TV show or a movie. We'd be, right at one of those climaxes where we end the season and have to wait till next season to find out what happens. Luckily, we don't have to wait. We can read ahead. I hope you have been reading ahead. I have. But 1 Samuel 21 and 22, there's a big story and there's a smaller story that happened at the same time. And we're going to take what I'm calling the lesser issue to start with, and that's the front page of your notes. It's really dealt with in chapter 21, 1 through 10. And it's when David runs away from Saul. He finds out that Saul really is trying to kill him. There's nothing Jonathan can do. His life is in danger. He runs away, and he runs to Nob. Now, Nob is where the tabernacle is now. It used to be in Shiloh. We really don't know when it got moved, but it's in Nob now. That's where the high priest is. Ahimelech is the priest. Ahimelech is running things. David runs to Nob. He sees Ahimelech. He asks him about the bread. Do you have any food for me? Ahimelech has this weird response like, what are you doing here? Where's your people? What's going on? This is not normal. And then David lies. He just lies. Oh, I'm on a secret mission. So secret I couldn't even get my sword or my men. I had to leave immediately. The king sent me, so I need some food. They have a conversation. Ahimelech agrees to give him the loaves of bread that were just removed from the tabernacle, which by the law was supposed to be eaten by the priests. But Ahimelech gives it to David. David says, do you have a weapon? Well, the sword of Goliath is here. David says, great, I'll take that. And then David leaves with the sword of Goliath and the bread. Ahimelech thinks he's helping him and his men, but it's just him at this point in time. And so in that narrative, there's a question that we could probably skip, honestly, but we're not going to. I think it's important. And so there it is in your notes. Was it okay for Ahimelech to give David the bread from the tabernacle? And it's not that we're so concerned about bread. What we're concerned about is the decision-making process that he went through in order to say, you know what, yeah, you can have the bread. And we really don't have a lot of insight here. We would be on our own to figure out what's happening, except that we have Matthew chapter 12. So leave your finger in 1 Samuel and go to Matthew chapter 12. And chapter 12, verse 1 through 14 is when Jesus is walking with his apostles, and his apostles reach down and pick grain off the side of the road, and they grind it in their hands and they eat it. And they do this because they're hungry, and it happens to be the Sabbath day. Now on the Sabbath, there were tons and tons of rules made up by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they made all these rules of things you can't do on the Sabbath because it might be wrong. And picking the grain was considered harvesting. And grinding it in your hand was considered work. And they broke 5, 6 rules simply by eating some of the grain that they found on the side of the road, which was permissible every other day of the week. And the Pharisees saw them. And they accused them of breaking the law. And they said, Jesus, if you're a teacher, how can you let this happen? How can you let your followers break so many Sabbath laws? And they were so uptight and self-righteous and just knew this was the very thing that would end his career. And Jesus answered them, and I'm going to read verse 3 through verse 8. It says, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, the very kind of loaves that Ahimelech gave to David. But it says, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temples desecrate the Sabbath, and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And what Jesus is trying to tell them is that there's more than your laws. There's more than your rules. You got to take into account the context. Take into account what's happening. And so Jesus says that when David and his men showed up and were hungry, they needed food, and the priest was right to give them the food. Them needing the food was a greater need than them taking it home to eat it themselves and obeying that part of the law. And Jesus never disregards the law, but basically says, here's two good things, and you need to weigh them out and choose well. And he says, and then there's the priests. You know, the priests, they have to work on the Sabbath, so they're breaking the commandment not to work on the Sabbath. Really just pointing out to them that even in the most sacred work, there's sometimes decisions to be made and issues that have to be resolved. And he said, sometimes serving me is greater than obeying me and keeping the law. It's really the discussion of legalism sometimes. I have a law and I can build a wall around it, and that wall can be so thick that it doesn't allow me to actually serve God. And so this is what's happening. Let's look at the notes real quick. Matthew 12 speaks of a similar event in David's life. This is not the day that David shows up to visit Ahimelech. This passage is not that day. We know that because it says when David showed up with his men. And I don't think Jesus is going to mess up the details like that. This is another occasion where David and his men showed up and ate the bread. But it gives us principles and gives us what God would think and what Jesus would say about this particular event. And so in your notes, A, David and his men ate consecrated bread reserved for the priest. So we have the law versus what happened. And we ask the question, was there an exemption here? Was an exception made? What's the right and the wrong here? Jesus also gives the example, be in your notes, the priests work on the Sabbath, yet are innocent. He gives those two examples. And see in your notes, here's the principle, or here's what Jesus is saying. Doing what's right is sometimes a higher standard than the letter of the law. And this is controversial. You should have cringed just a little bit when I said that. Because the law doesn't change. We know that. God doesn't change. God doesn't have two sets of standards. Yet, it sounds like there's two sets of standards. But what we really have is two competing truths. And two good moral behaviors that only one can take place at a time. So let me give you a couple of examples also in your notes. Example number one. Let's say you're walking down the road, you're driving home today, you notice there's a house on fire and nobody's there yet. So you pull in, you run up to the door, ring the doorbell, knock on the door, and you're there to warn them, hey, get out of the house, your house is on fire. Nobody answers, so you peek in and you see somebody laying on the floor. Now the law says you can't break down a door and you can't break the glass to reach through and open the door. That's called breaking and entering, and you can go to jail for that. And since we all know several law enforcement officers, it wouldn't be hard to find somebody to arrest you. And so obviously we would never break down that door or break the glass to get in. That's the legalistic approach. The other approach is there's a person laying on the floor who will probably die if I don't get in there, so I will kick the door down, I will break the glass and reach in and unlock the door. I'll do what it takes to save that life. So we have two good moral choices. I will not break into someone's house, and I will not allow someone to die when I can help them. Two good moral choices. And it's very obvious to everyone in this room that this is the choice we make. We don't have to call someone and ask, what do you think I should do? We know what to do. And so that's a really kind of blatant example there. Example number two, lying to protect the innocent from a violent aggressor. I always think back to Nazi Germany and the Jewish people, and there was a group of people who knew what the Nazis were doing was wrong, and they went against the wishes of their own government, risked their own lives to hide Jewish people in their homes. Under the floorboards, behind cupboards, wherever they were. And people, when they would knock on the door and they would say, "It's been reported to us that you have Jewish people in the home. Where are they?" Well, there's the moral law that we don't lie to the government officials. And so are we supposed to go, "Well, they're over there behind the wall"? No, there's a greater truth, that we protect the life of the innocent from the aggressor who is doing the bidding of Satan and not the bidding of God. And so on paper, we have two moral choices that both are correct, but in reality, there's only one. And so we see the priest who has spent his entire life knowing that nobody eats this bread except me and my family. It's God's provision for us. It's God's way for us. It's God's way of saying what happens in the tabernacle is special. And it's God's way of saying it matters. And so my entire life, no one has ever eaten that bread except my family. My father, the priest before me and my family now, my sons one day when they take over. No one's ever ate that bread except us. But I see a higher moral calling. A servant of the king, a servant of God, a hero of the land is hungry and needs help. I will give you the bread. It obviously happened at least twice. It might have happened more often. And Jesus calls that to remembrance and says, "Hey, this is what went on." And he kind of tells them, you guys didn't have a problem with that, so you shouldn't have a problem with this. And of course, he gives examples 3 and 4, performing your priestly duties on a day reserved for rest, and giving the showbread to the men. Number 2 in your notes, having said all that I said, that sometimes there's two competing truths, and we have to look at the entirety of the context to know which is the right thing to do. Here's the warning. There's a fine line between rationalization and making a difficult moral decision. Okay, this Ahimelech, in deciding to give the bread, ask questions. What are you doing? Where's your men? Have they consecrated themselves? Are they pure? He asked questions, and he made a moral decision. He evaluated. He weighed the two questions, and he decided to give the bread. We rationalize really well. I can come up with 10 reasons why what I want is the best decision to make. It's literally how we argue with anybody we ever argue with. My opinion is the most valid and important opinion, and I can give you 9 reasons why, and if you only have 6, then I win. And we move like that. But when it comes to making moral decisions, we really have to slow down. We really have to ask the important questions. And the last question we ask is, which is more glorifying to God? Or sometimes we ask, is either of them glorifying to God? Sometimes we may actually have a choice. Sometimes the decision is, no, I can't do either one. Sometimes is, I must do one over the other, even though I've always been told not to do that. And so in these situations where there's two competing truths, two good moral behaviors to choose from, we have to weigh it out. A couple of examples, A in your notes. Do I bail my son out of jail, or do I let him stay there to learn a lesson? Some of you already answered the question for yourself. But I want you to know that the person who answered opposite could also be correct. Okay, these are two competing goods. Get my son out of jail, leave him there to learn a lesson. In making that moral decision, I have to ask the question, which is more glorifying to God? I don't ask the question, what's going to make my son feel better about the situation? I might ask the question, what's going to help my son learn a lesson which would be glorifying to God? Right? I have to ask good questions in order to come to the right answer. B is an out there example, but we just passed the anniversary of an abortionist being murdered, and it set back the pro-life movement quite a bit and gave a lot of ammunition to the pro-choice movement. And what somebody thought they were doing for good actually wound up being used for more bad. So the example is, do I bomb an abortion clinic in order to stop abortions from taking place? The rationalization says, well, anything I do to stop abortion is a good thing, and so God will be happy with me. And of course, the conversation's longer there, but that's the gist of it. But the moral, greater glory to God answer comes when I finally say to myself, I will be doing exactly what I'm accusing them of doing if I murder someone. How is my act of murder going to glorify God? And so we say, no, I won't do that. I won't murder somebody. I won't plant a bomb. I won't do this or that. I'll find another way. And so what may sound legit on the surface, and by the way, there was months of argument in the airwaves, on the news, in the circles of those fighting against abortion about whether this was right or wrong, whether we needed to take this step or not. And that's a very worldly way to approach it. We actually call it terrorism. Okay? And it's wrong. And if you know me, you know I'm 164% against abortion. But that's a step in the wrong direction. That does not bring glory to God. So even though it might be effective for a time, it's the wrong decision. So I need to watch the temptation to rationalize out my idea versus making a moral decision that glorifies God. Ahimelech made the decision to give the bread, and he made the right decision. Jesus validated it in Matthew. So here's the principle to file away in your hearts. The principle to file away, the lesser issue, here's the principle. If you have to choose between doing two good but opposing actions, recognize that this is not black and white, and proceed with caution. Realize it's not black and white, and proceed with caution. You might be fighting against a creed that you've memorized or been taught. You might be fighting against a tradition that's been in place. You might be fighting against a moral law that you thought was as black and white as can be. And you might be faced with loving your neighbor as yourself. You can come up with your own examples if you want to. But when faced with these things, proceed with caution. And that's what Ahimelech did. He proceeded with caution. He took the information that he had, and he gave him the bread. So application from that principle. Number one, don't make rash decisions when it comes to moral dilemmas. We're going to talk more about rash decisions because there's some rash decisions that David's going to make. But don't make rash decisions. Do what Ahimelech did. Figure out the pros and cons. Ask, does this glorify God? Number two, use context to determine which answer glorifies God the most. Context. In that example of bailing out my son, is this the first time? Is this the fifth time? Has he learned in the past? Will he learn now? Context. What actually happened? Why is he there? Okay. Number three, keep your answer, the reasoning behind it, and be able to explain it to others. Know your answer. Know the reasoning behind it and be able to explain it to others. If you can't explain your answer, then you're not ready to make the decision. Okay? And if you're not ready to make the decision, then you step back and you wait a little while. We always think a decision has to be made right now. Usually, a better decision is made in a few hours, or a day, or a few days, or a week. We get in a rush that's usually not real. Know your answer, know the reasoning behind it so that you can explain it, especially to the person that it's going to affect the most. And then number four, make sure honoring, glorifying, and obeying God is the higher priority than honoring, glorifying, and obeying tradition even when it's a good one, even when it's a good tradition. Okay? Now, I probably just created more questions in your mind than answers, and that's okay. I'm just giving you what was given. Okay? When you are faced with a moral decision that's difficult to make, the advice that I saw coming out of this story of Ahimelech and David is that it's not always black and white. I should proceed with caution, and I don't make a decision until I've heard from God, until I know this is glorifying to God. And I'm just going to drop that for right now and move on to the bigger issue, and then we'll bring it back together at the end. So the other side of your notes, the greater issue, is David's sudden lack of faith. David's sudden lack of faith. Talking to someone this morning, they had read the text and their observation was David was scared. David killed Goliath and now he's scared. That's a correct observation. David, who was the man of faith, who walked into camp with lunch, saw Goliath railing against the nation of Israel and God, put away his supplies, picked up his sling, and marched out to face Goliath and killed him, and then gave the glory to God. That David, who faced the giant with no fear, full of faith, knowing what God was going to do, that same David is now afraid of King Saul, who's trying to kill him. And that fear and lack of faith is a problem. It's a lapse of faith right now. And we'll see that. We're glad it's a lapse of faith. But he has a sudden lack of faith. What did David do? In your notes, what David did. First of all, he ran to Nob. He ran to Nob without consulting God in the matter. Now, running to Nob was not a bad idea. We just don't know if that was God's idea. Nob was where the tabernacle was. Nob was where the priest was. Going to the tabernacle to talk to the priest sounds like a really good idea. And what we see David learning a little farther down, especially when we start chapter 23, David's learning that before I make big moves, I should ask God what he wants me to do. In chapter 23, the Philistines attack a city. And David, who's been in the military, who's led teams of thousands, who's ready to roll, instead of just running there, he says, God, should I take my men and go fight the Philistines? Seems like an obvious answer. But he stopped to ask this time because David learned his lesson. He asked the question, should I go? And then we'll talk about how all that went when we get to chapter 23. But David ran to Nob. Maybe God wanted him to stay and confront Saul. Maybe God wanted him to take different steps. But he ran. Most importantly, he didn't stop to ask God anything about it. Number two, what did David do? He lied to Ahimelech the priest. He just flat out lied. He ran into town, scared to death, hungry, ran up to the priest. You got any bread? Well, I only got this bread. You know what's going on? Oh, secret mission. So important. I didn't even have time to change my clothes and get my sword. I can't stay long. I need the bread. Totally lied about the whole thing. Lied about having men outside of town waiting for him. Lied about the whole thing. Number three, he took Goliath's sword. And you see in your notes it says, as a security blanket. The end of verse 9 says, if you want it, take it. And David says, there is none like it. Give it to me. There's none like it. He seized Goliath's sword. And by the way, remember who Goliath was? 4.5 to 5 feet taller than David. Carried spears that we couldn't pack through them, that kind of stuff. Do you really think his sword was the one that David should be fighting with? He probably put it in his belt and it probably drug on the ground behind him. It was not a smart move on David, but what he said was, there's no sword like it. What he was saying was, this is what I'm going to put my faith in. This is going to be my protection, my security blanket, if you will. So he took Goliath's sword. Number 4, he ignored Doeg. And if you remember who Doeg was, he was someone who worked for Saul. He was in charge of his sheep, his head herdsman. He worked for Saul, and David saw him. We learn later, at the end of the reading, that David says, I saw him and I knew he was going to be trouble. I should have done something. He says, I have regret, but at this moment in time, he ignored him. He said, my issues are too important right now. I'm running from someone who's trying to kill me. I'm hungry. I got some bread. I need to get out of here. I'm going to ignore Doeg, even though he was a threat. And then number 5, he ran again and tried to hide among the Philistines. He didn't feel safe at the tabernacle with the priest and Nob, and so he kind of thought to himself, enemy of my enemy is my friend. Saul will never look for me among the enemy. I'll go hide near Gath. Well, we find out from other passages that he actually got captured and taken before the king in Gath. And we'll get that in a minute. So David ran, he lied, he took Goliath's sword as a security blanket. He ignored Doeg, who was obviously a threat, and then he ran and hid among the Philistines. That is what David did when he was having a lack of faith. Okay? That lack of faith caused things to happen. This is what David caused. 4 things in your notes. He caused an entire family of priests to be killed. Ahimelech and his entire family were summoned to go before the king. The king said, what are you doing helping my enemy? Ahimelech says, what enemy? David, he's my sworn enemy. Ahimelech says, David, he's like the hero of all Israel. He serves you well. You should be excited that I helped him. What's the deal? I didn't know he was your enemy. Saul basically said, doesn't matter. I'm going to kill you. He ordered his servants to kill the entire family, 70 of them I think there was, and they wouldn't do it, so he says, Doeg, do the job. Doeg just kills them all. An entire family, an entire priestly family is dead because of David's actions. Number 2, the entire city of Nob was wiped out. Doeg didn't stop with the family. He went back to where the family came from, back to the city where the tabernacle was held. And he wiped out the entire town. No telling how many people that was. Wiped out all their animals too. So an entire family of priests were killed. An entire city of Nob was wiped out. His own capture by the Philistines. And you might say, well, how do we know that he was captured by the Philistines? Well, we look at Psalm chapter 56, and in the beginning it says, for the directory of music to the tune of a dove of different oaks of David. And it says, when the Philistines had seized him in Gath. When the Philistines had seized him in Gath. And then we read this psalm, and it talks about David being in Gath. So we know they seized him. So his actions caused him to be captured. Probably because he shows up in town dragging Goliath's sword on his belt. Goliath was a hero. They knew this was the sword. He didn't hide very well. And he shows up and they're like, hey, this is David. Capture him, take him to the king, see what the king wants to do. And then number 4, David also caused his entire family to be in danger from Saul, because when Saul couldn't get David, what's the next best thing? I'm going to get his family. His family had to leave their land and their possessions. They had to run and join David in the caves, join his party and be protected by David. So David ran to Nob, lied to Ahimelech, took Goliath's sword, ignored the threat Doeg, and then ran to the Philistines to try to hide from Saul there. Because of that, an entire family of priests were killed. An entire city was wiped out. He was captured by the Philistines, and his family is in danger. So there's consequences. So we have what David did and what David caused. Let's talk about what David should have done. Number 1, David should have told Ahimelech everything and sought God's counsel. He ran to the tabernacle and he talked to the priest. He should have said, Ahimelech, I don't know what's going on. Saul's trying to kill me. I didn't do anything. This is unjust. I came here because I don't know where to go. I don't know who I can trust. Saul's calling on everyone to kill me. Talk to God on my behalf. Ask him what I should do. I'll do whatever God says. He should have right then and there turned to God and said, what should I do? He is, after all, the guy that killed Goliath. He is, after all, the guy that went and collected 200 foreskins to pay his bride's price. He was, after all, the guy who led soldiers into army and won every battle and was famous for doing this. But now all of a sudden he's in flight mode, and he should have just stopped and said, Ahimelech, inquire of God for me. What should I do? And Ahimelech would have inquired of God and told him what to do. And Ahimelech would have known that Saul was trying to kill him. And Ahimelech could have been prepared and maybe not gone to see the king or gone with a different message. God might have said, David, you've put Ahimelech in danger. Go back to Saul and face him. All kinds of things could have happened if he had stopped right there. He should have trusted God to continue to protect him. All he had to do was look back and see what God had already done. Protected him from the lion, protected him from the bear, protected him from Goliath, protected him in battle, protecting him from Saul's spears. He should have said, God has protected me, protected me, protected me, protected me, all to keep this promise he made when I was 14 or 15 years old. And the promise hasn't been fulfilled yet, so he will continue to protect me. I can rest assured in this. And then ask God what to do. He should have done that. He should have, 3, realized that he put Ahimelech in danger. He should have saw Doeg and thought to himself, I know what Saul's like. I know he's going crazy. I know he's tried to kill me and he tried to kill Jonathan. If he knows that Ahimelech helped me, he's going to try to kill him. And he should have done something about it. He should have stopped, realized, and reacted. And number 4, he should have stayed to protect Nob until God instructed him otherwise. So we have what he did, what he caused, what he should have done. Now we get to David's response. And so we'll pick up the story in various places, but let's just look at the number 1, his response. He takes responsibility for Ahimelech and Nob. The very end of what we read, he finds out what happens and he says, oh man, I saw him there. I should have known. He says, this is my fault. We don't know what he did about it, but we do know that he took responsibility for it. But right after he took responsibility, he made another rash decision. And he wound up in Gath, captured by the king who lived there, fearful of his life. Because what did they say when they caught him? Isn't this David? Isn't this the one they sing the songs about? Isn't he rumored to be the next king of Israel? Boy, we caught us a good one. Took him to the king, and he was at the mercy of the king. And in that situation, he finally stopped, praises God, and prays for deliverance. In Psalm 56, this is what he says, okay? This is when the Philistines had seized him. He's in captivity. He says, be merciful to me, O God, for my enemies are in hot pursuit. All day long they press their attack. In verse 3 he says, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, and I am not afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Verse 10, he says, in God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust, and I am not afraid. What can man do to me? He's caught, he's stuck, and he stops and he praises God. God, I know who you are. I know what you can do. And he prays, deliver me from my enemies. They're everywhere. There's Saul. There's the Philistines. Deliver me from them. He says, I'm not afraid because I put my trust in you. He went back to being the David who faced Goliath. And he said, I am in a pickle here. I thought I could hide among the Philistines. I couldn't hide. I brought this stupid sword with me, and they found me out. Now they have the sword back, and I'm just a sitting duck. I'm here. What do I do? God, I'm in your mercy. I'm totally dependent on you. I have nowhere to go except for you to save me. Have mercy on me, my God. I will not be afraid. So he stops, he praises, and he prays for deliverance, and then he acts. Psalm 34, which says of David, when he pretended to be insane before him, Abimelech, who drove him away, and he left. So here's what happened. He's caught, and he says, God, I need help. And this is a little odd, but I think God said, act like you're crazy. So he starts talking to himself and doing weird things. And he goes and scratches the wall and draws on the wall. And he starts drooling down his beard. And he starts acting crazy. And why would that matter? Because of superstition. The Philistines thought that if there was a crazy man among them, it brought them a curse. And so Ahimelech, the king of Gath, who would have loved to kill David and parade his body around, saw crazy David and said, I can't have this guy around. If he's around, bad things are going to start to happen. So he literally drove him away. So God gave him the answer. And in verse 4 he says, I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. This poor man called and the Lord heard him. He saved me out of all his troubles. And then verse 12, in his response from being saved, he says, whoever loves life and desires to see many good days, here's my advice, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. What had David done? He had lied to Ahimelech. He says, if you want to live long and you want to have a good life, don't be telling lies. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. In verse 18, he says, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. So God saves him because David responds correctly. And by the way, we know that David is a man after God's own heart. This is why. Because even when he messes up, when he realizes it, he turns back to God every single time. And then the last response, number 4, he gets back to serving God in Israel. Beginning in chapter 23. The Philistines are attacking that city. God, should we go? God says, yes, you should go. His men go, are you sure that's what God said? I'll ask again. God, should I go? Go. He says, we're going. He goes and he starts back to serving God and serving Israel. Gets back to doing what he had always done and what God blessed him for doing. There's a principle in this issue too. It's in your notes. Rash decisions lead to irrational and regrettable outcomes. The priest's family dead, the town wiped out, he's caught by his enemy and he has to pretend he's insane. Irrational and regrettable outcomes and behaviors. Okay? His rash decisions, the decision to run before talking to God both times, to lie to the priest instead of telling the truth, his rash decisions caused him to run, lie, and hide, and cost hundreds of lives. It also got him arrested by the Philistines. Application. 2 applications. I'm going to give you a third one. First application, number 1, is simply remember. Just write the word down. Remember. Okay? Remember who God is and what he's done. Remember who you are and who you belong to. Remember what God's called you to, what promises he's made. Remember all these things in difficult situations. But the full sentence here. Remember and never forget that God's promises are solid and dependable, not only in the good times, but especially in the difficult times. We walk around happy, just cheering God's promises when everything's going great. But you know when we really need God's promises is when everything's going bad. When it's not working out like we planned and we don't see the outcome we're hoping for, that's when those promises are the most important. And that's when our faith is the most crucial. And my faith will be strong when I remember who God is, what he has already done, and what he has promised to do. Application number 2, as soon as you realize you have rashly gone in the wrong direction, as soon as you realize I made a dumb decision, I've dug a hole I can't get out of, stop. Just stop. stop. Stop right there. Make things right with God. David praised God, then he prayed to God, then he obeyed God. Right? When you realize that you have got yourself in a pickle, stop, make things right with God, then seek his will on exactly what you should do next, because that's when he's going to show you what it is. If you don't stop to praise and pray, he's not going to give you the answers. And then the third application, which you can write at the bottom if you want, is simply this: be a man after God's own heart. Be a woman after God's own heart. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to say something you shouldn't have said. You're going to make a rash decision that's going to get you and someone else into trouble. Things will happen. But if you're going to be the man or the woman after God's own heart, when you realize it, you're going to stop. You're going to seek after God. And then you're going to move forward in the right direction. All right? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this message. Thank you for these wonderful children that we love and appreciate. Thank you for their parents and the patience they have, their desire for them to be in church. Thank you that we're a family and we learn together and we grow together. Help us not to make rash decisions. And if we do, help us to immediately turn back to you so that we can be a man or a woman after God's own heart. And in the decisions that we do have to make, help us to weigh them out with your word in mind and with your glory in mind, not just our own desires. The two stories go together. And that's the lesson for us. Help us to learn it. Help us to live it. In your Son's name I pray.